Welcome back to India and the World. In today's episode, we examine the decision that froze the map of Kashmir for generations. One question that often comes up in debates, be it slanging matches between political parties or intellectual discussions on military history is, why did India go to the United Nations in January 1948 when its army was advancing in Kashmir? Why didn't we take the operations to their logical conclusion, throw back the invaders and vacate entire Jammu and Kashmir? To understand this decision, we must step into a nation that was bleeding, bankrupt and barely standing, yet determined to define itself as a moral power. I had covered the origin of the Kashmir dispute in the last episode. To quickly recap, under the Indian Independence Act, the princely states had the option either to accede to India or Pakistan. But Jammu and Kashmir, right up to October, was undecided. Maharaja Hari Singh had been playing for time, and then came the invasion by the tribal Lashkars, supported, armed and guided by elements of Pakistani establishment, who stormed into Kashmir. The Maharaja then hurriedly signed the instrument of accession on October 26, 1947. But by then, Muzaffarabad and Domel had fallen. Atrocities were reported from Baramulla and Srinagar would have been next. Then, on the morning of 27th October, Indian troops landed in Srinagar. Kashmir was saved and the war had begun. By late 1947, Indian forces had stabilized the valley and secured Ladakh. But the western districts, that is Mirpur, Poonch and Gilgit, remained in turmoil and under Pakistani occupation. India approached the United Nations in January 1948 and a UN-mediated ceasefire came into effect a year later in January 1949. One-third of Jammu and Kashmir remained under the control of Pakistan as it does till date. Why did India approach the UN and agreed to a ceasefire without liberating entire Kashmir? Was it naivety on the part of Indian leaders? Were they being manipulated by the British? Or was it military weakness? Or was it a calculated act of restraint? Let's examine this from a very dispassionate manner. Let's first talk about the role played by the British through their representative, Lord Mountbatten, who was India's first Governor General. It was he who persuaded the Indian government to refer Kashmir issue to the United Nations. Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru and Deputy Prime Minister Sardar Patel were in favor of striking at the bases of the raiders within Pakistan to stop the invasion. They viewed this as a necessity for the security of Kashmir. But Mountbatten strongly opposed this counter-strike strategy. He warned Nehru that a war between India and Pakistan would not be confined to the subcontinent. He called this idea a fatal illusion. He used his considerable influence and position to bulldoze decisions against the better sense of Nehru and Patel, effectively vetoing their plans to launch military operations against Pakistan. Instead, he aggressively promoted the idea of asking United Nations to send a team immediately to help stop the hostilities. He led Nehru and Patel to believe that the UN would promptly direct Pakistan to withdraw the raiders. He assured Nehru that the British government and the United States would take action through the United Nations to ensure Pakistan's complete withdrawal. Nehru eventually agreed to the UN reference as a compromise. He thought it made sense to exhaust peaceful means before resorting to an all-out war. Mountbatten also kept the British Prime Minister Clement Attlee secretly informed about India's plans. He passed on the full text of his correspondence with Nehru and minutes of the Defence Committee meetings to London. This enabled Attlee to send informed messages pressuring Nehru to exercise restraint and proceed with the UN appeal instead of military action. Mountbatten's primary motivation was to prevent a war between the two dominions, which would have been disastrous for British geopolitical interests. But his advice ultimately led to the issue becoming an international dispute rather than a straightforward case of aggression. Indian officials felt that Mountbatten had scuttled their military response and prevented the complete liberation of Kashmir. A food for thought here is Jinnah became the Governor General of Pakistan on independence, while India chose to appoint Lord Mountbatten after he had supervised the partition of the subcontinent as the last Viceroy. How different would things have been had we chosen an Indian Governor General who would have had India's best interests at heart and not those of the British? But of course, one can't change history, only learn from it. So, nudged by Mountbatten and Attlee, Nehru approached the United Nations on January 1st, 1948. India invoked Article 35 of UN Charter and formally referred the Kashmir matter to the Security Council. He did so in good faith, believing in UN's moral authority. Nehru was an idealist. He was sure UN's actions would be fair and just, but the results were deeply disappointing. Instead of condemning Pakistan and demanding immediate withdrawal of the invaders, the agenda itself was reframed from the Jammu and Kashmir question to the broader India-Pakistan question. This allowed Pakistan to introduce unrelated issues such as Junagadh and allegations of communal atrocities. In Nehru's view, the central issue of invasion was blurred and downgraded and lost in procedural debates and diplomatic maneuvering. Nehru was particularly disturbed that the Security Council treated India and Pakistan at an equal footing. India had approached the UN as a complainant. India's case was straightforward. Jammu and Kashmir were a part of India since the Maharaja had acceded to it. Pakistan had aided and armed tribal raiders who had invaded Jammu and Kashmir. The UN should therefore declare Pakistan as the aggressor and direct it to withdraw. But the UN resolutions ignored this distinction between the complainant and the invader. Both Indian and Pakistani forces were treated as foreign presences requiring withdrawal. As one contemporary account put it, Nehru felt like a man who had gone to report a burglary and found himself placed in the dock alongside the burglar. The April 21st, 1948 resolution further deepened India's frustration. It proposed a plebiscite administrator be appointed by the UN Secretary General, endowed with sweeping powers and functioning independently of the state government. The suggestion that India's administration in Kashmir be replaced with a neutral regime to facilitate a plebiscite was very galling. This appeared to be a move towards placing Kashmir under international supervision. For India, this was no longer mediation, it was an intrusion into its sovereign governance. It is important to note that Nehru was not opposed to the idea of plebiscite in principle. Mountbatten had introduced this idea initially when he included a reference to plebiscite in his letter accepting Kashmir's accession. In his radio broadcast on 2nd November 1947, Nehru himself had publicly committed to a referendum under international auspices once law and order had been restored. But for Nehru, the sequence was non-negotiable. First, end aggression and restore territorial integrity. Pakistani forces should withdraw from entire Kashmir and then hold a plebiscite. The Security Council resolution attempted to reverse this order. It focused heavily on the modalities of a future plebiscite but failed to ensure prior withdrawal of the invaders. By linking ceasefire arrangements to complex political conditions, the resolution prolonged uncertainty and allowed hostile forces to consolidate their positions. Nehru had sought a judicial verdict on an aggression. What he received was political intervention that internationalized the dispute and equated both the parties. It shifted focus from invasion to plebiscite mechanics. The gap between expectation and outcome marked a turning point in India's early engagement with United Nations. But why was a clear case of invasion framed as a dispute? To answer that, we must view the issue from the geopolitical perspective of the British and its Western allies. Britain viewed Kashmir through the lens of the Great Game. To her, Gilgit-Baltistan was not just mountainous wilderness, it was a geopolitically vital piece of land because it bordered Afghanistan, Xinjiang, and Soviet Central Asia. The British had realized this importance much earlier and therefore had forced the Maharaja to sign a 60-year lease in 1935, handing over the administration of Gilgit Agency to them. This allowed them to establish a listening post to monitor Soviet activities in Central Asia. Post World War II, just when Indian independence was being discussed, was also the time that the Cold War was beginning. Pakistan's geography was strategically invaluable. It was seen as the keystone of the strategic arc of the Indian Ocean, as well as the Islamic arc stretching from Turkey to Pakistan that would serve as a barrier against Soviet expansion in the region. India, under Nehru, was leaning towards non-alignment and his ideology was more in line with Russian socialism than Western capitalism. Pakistan appeared more pliant given its nascent politics, internal instability and quest for security. It was assumed that being militarily weak and economically dependent, Pakistan would be a willing ally. It could be convinced to offer port facilities at Karachi and air bases at Peshawar to the west. Thus, diplomatic pressure from west did not favor a decisive Indian victory and a total liberation of Kashmir. If Gilgit-Baltistan remained under the control of Pakistan, it would remain available for Western military and subversive activities against the Soviet Union. The ceasefire was therefore an outcome of crafty maneuvering and deceit rather than a purely moral adjudication by the United Nations. Now let us address the most persistent and logical argument. India could have taken all of Kashmir if it had continued. But let's look at the situation. By late 1948, India controlled roughly 63% of Jammu and Kashmir. Pakistan controlled about 37%. Indian commanders like General Karyappa and Thimaya believed a spring offensive could have cleared remaining areas. No doubt they were right, but the counter argument that some offer is at what cost? Consider these factors. The terrain was extreme. Winter had already set in and logistics were stretched. The army was still reorganizing after partition. India's industrial base was fractured. The nation was absorbing millions of refugees. India was a newly independent nation and its treasury was strained. Nehru himself wrote that defense spending was swallowing development expenditure. The choice was stark: continue war for uncertain months or consolidate gains and stabilize the republic. Prolonged campaign in the northern areas would require massive logistics, mountain warfare infrastructure, and a permanent garrison in hostile terrain. India did not yet have the capacity for indefinite high altitude occupation. Under these circumstances, strategic restraint doesn't seem to be a weakness, it seems to be a cost-benefit analysis. Now comes a harder question. Suppose India had taken Gilgit-Baltistan and Mirpur. What then? Now these regions were ethnically and culturally distinct. They had mixed political loyalties and were geographically isolated. India would have inherited rugged terrain, fragile communications and possible insurgency. Remember, India in 1948 was also managing Hyderabad, Junagadh, refugee violence, food shortages. Could the Republic afford another permanent flashpoint? Thus, with possibly these thoughts that India agreed to the UN proposal and the ceasefire line came into effect. But what was meant to be temporary became structural. The UN process stalled. The plebiscite conditions were never fulfilled because Pakistan never withdrew its armed forces from the occupied regions. And the line of control, though unnamed then, hardened. Critics argue we stopped too soon. Supporters argue we stopped just in time. But one thing is certain, the decision was not made lightly. It was made under economic constraint, diplomatic pressure, military realism, and institutional fragility. This episode reveals something deeper about Indian strategic culture even at that nascent stage. Three enduring principles emerge. Political primacy over military ambition. The ultimate decision was taken by political leaders and not by military generals. Preference for international legitimacy rather than use of force. And the risk aversion against multi-front escalation. India chose to be a responsible state even at the cost of territory. Was it naive or was it foresighted? History offers no easy verdict, but it offers only context. As a postscript, interestingly, we can see echoes of this strategic restraint doctrine in India's recent actions during Op Sindoor. There is a school of thought which criticized India's decision to accept a ceasefire instead of consolidating its initial gains by escalating the conflict. It could clearly have done so. But if one analyzes Indian objectives behind the operation and the cost-benefit analysis of escalation versus cessation of hostilities after achieving those objectives, the rationality is clear. Strategic restraint is not a weakness when it comes from a position of strength, a position of informed choice. I'll wrap up today's episode here. In the next episode, we'll take a deeper dive into the larger geopolitics behind the partition itself. Thank you for listening and see you next time.